everyone. Yes, hello, Mike. I can see someone in the chat saying hello from a very wet West Wales. Well, I'm in South Wales, where it's also very wet. Whether it's as wet as West Wales, I'm not too sure, but it's certainly wet and rainy where I am. So I am here to share this webinar event. So my name is David Wilkins. I'm a reader in social work at Cardiff University. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction now, give you some housekeeping sort of information, introduce Peter Beresford, who we're very fortunate to have here today as our speaker, and then I will hand over to Peter. So let me start by welcoming everyone to this, the first webinar in a new ExChange conference series called On the Journey, Navigating Mental Health. As I say, we're joined today by Peter Beresford. He's going to be doing the main talk, the main presentation. Great. So I am going to introduce our speaker today, who is Peter Beresford. Peter is a visiting professor at UAE, and he's co-chair of Shaping Our Lives. I'm going to put a link to their website in the chat, so if you want to find out more about Shaping Our Lives, you'll be able to do that. Peter has an abiding interest in participation and everything and anything that entails, and in how we value and in valuing people's lived experiences. There's much more I could say about Peter and his achievements. He's asked me very modestly not to, so I'm going to bite my tongue and hand over at this point and say welcome to Peter. Thank you very much for coming along. We're delighted to have you, and I'm looking forward to your talk today. So over to Peter, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot, David, and it's really nice to be in this virtual event, virtual for me. And just I have to tell you that I have to make notes for what I'm going to say, so I'll be looking up and down. So forgive me for that, but it's the only way I can get what I want to say as I want to say it. Right, so I'm going to start now. I remember reading a famous modern quotation, which did make me chuckle. Each of us is unique, it said, just like everyone else. It's funny, it's true. On the surface, it might seem like it's knocking us and each of us is belief in being special, but I think it also has a wisdom in it, because simply said, each of us is unique, and the fact that that's true for all of us doesn't make it any less true or less important. So I want to start with this uniqueness of who we are and our lived experience, and the fact that curiously it's something we all actually share, because it helps us, I think, to understand and appreciate both our particularity and that of other people, whatever role we are in. However, for example, we come to mental or emotional distress and the search for well-being. I think this is so important when we come to think about issues of mental distress and madness. The traditional approach or model for coming at this issue has tended to be based on ideas of mental illness, and has tended also to divide us essentially into two groups, the mentally ill and everyone else. And I think that's damaging, stigmatizing, and ultimately unhelpful and mistaken. I realized this really when I was in a psychiatric hospital and when I started to get involved in survivor-led organizations. I realized that we all had something in common which created a powerful and helpful bond. We knew what it was to experience madness and distress, however we talked about it, and we could share that experience and gain reassurance that there wasn't something uniquely awful about any of us. And we could learn things from each other, from coping to understanding, as well as have safe spaces together where we could be honest about ourselves and not have to be ashamed of or feel ashamed of ourselves or feel subject to discrimination. But I also at the same time began to learn something else. What might be a problem for another person might not be for me, and vice versa. What affected us and how, what barriers we faced, what horrors and fears we might experience could all be different. In one sense, we had a shared understanding, but in others, we could be amazingly different. This, I think, is helpful to come to realize. It certainly has been for me. Madness and distress, as those are the terms I prefer to use, are things that can happen to any of us. Just make the pressures great enough of trauma, violence, conflict, loss, fear, confusion, And I think pretty well anyone can be included in that category. And there's probably even a label for those who it's felt can't be. To try and help us make sense of madness and distress, we've relied for some time now on the typology of a medical model borrowed from physical health. It includes diagnosis, treatment, recovery. And I think it just hasn't worked out that well in many cases. Personally, I don't think that so-called mental illness is essentially the same as physical illness or amenable to the same kind of modeling, assumptions, and responses that gets. I do believe that holistic understandings, which include the psychological and the physical, are helpful, but I also don't think our psychiatric approaches to madness and distress have generally helped us make those connections and recognize the indivisibility of the physical and the psychological and emotional, let alone the social. Psych system responses to perceived mental illness or distress, as I've said, major on ideas like diagnosis and on responses like so-called talking treatments and particularly, of course, drug treatments. A lot's been said about the short supply of the first and the over-reliance on the second. But what this model is essentially concerned with is what goes on in the individual and what it may be, as it's seen about the individual, that's meant things have gone wrong. It's an individualized approach, mainly to explanation and treatment, even if it may involve people in group activities sometimes. But we know that a counter-understanding has also long been there and found particular expression among service users, survivors, and our movements. That's based much more clearly on social approaches, on experiential understanding, and on developing individual and collective experiential knowledge, what we know that comes from our lived experience, and also responses that build on this and on the insights that come from direct experience of madness and distress. Now, I find this approach much more helpful, both for general understanding and for managing my own experience of madness and distress, that the survivor movement and more recently, the Mad Studies movement, I think both offer many insights based on such an approach for living with these experiences, thinking about them, dealing with them, and as workers are helping address them. And at the heart of these, I think, are a preparedness to value the person in the broader context of their relationships, society, and their experience, their culture, and the rest. We've seen this interest come from all social movements, including that of disabled people and mental health service users, survivors. So we can see such movements like the survivors movement valuing a number of things, characteristics. And running through these, I think these include, and others will have maybe other lists, social approaches and models, as I've said, for understanding people's situation and experience, like the social model of disability and social understandings of madness and distress. They don't just see a problem in the individual and that there's necessarily something wrong with them, but rather in their interactions, that's the connection they make with the wider world and how it seems sees them and treats them, often, of course, negatively and in an inferior way. Next, valuing the first-hand perspectives of service users, how people see themselves and their issues, what they see as the problem, not necessarily what other people without that experience see. They seek to recognize and value these approaches, our uniqueness and our diversity. We aren't all the same as mental health service users, survivors. We can all, as I've said, be different and different in different ways at the same time. And that really needs to be recognized. And then our lived experience and the experiential knowledge that comes from it, what we know from living our lives, from our perspectives of madness and distress, that is given value and importance and needs to be recognized. And of course, it's complex according to who we are in other terms. That we're ensured opportunities for us to work things out together for ourselves, not only individually in our own lives, but also working together as people with shared identities and experience with support from our own user-led organizations and movements. That such an approach would highlight our right to speak and act for ourselves, rather than other people being the lead in doing it for or to us. We are people too, with rights as human beings, which should be valued and respected. And as part of this, there is recognition of the importance of self-defined support. What we think and have learned can be helpful for us, not just what experts and other people have decided. This is more likely to work and give us a real sense of ownership. I think all this challenges the conventional and traditional mainstream psychologizing Western understandings of madness and distress as conditions or disorders that come from nowhere, as it were, just like come from our brains, our self, or our nature, whatever that is. It's like we are computers, that the drugs, the ECT or whatever can set to restart, to sort us out. And I want to suggest that instead we need to have an holistic approach, which takes account of the social as well as the individual and the mind-body wholeness of us and our own understandings of these. Moreover, it's holistic in its understanding of us now, but also over time. It tries to help us make sense of ourselves and each other through our lives, even perhaps beyond people's lives. And that's the same goes for other people. Tries to reconnect the past, present, and also future, giving value to our own understandings of our experience and seeking to help us unravel those relationships. I don't believe that in our society we truly value children or necessarily listen to them or what's happened in our childhood and how we have tried to deal with it. There's begun to be better understanding of that in some, for example, trauma-based approaches, and in recognition of the impact of childhood sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. All I'm saying is that to address our futures, we need sometimes to address our past. We need to address the children we have been. At a time of personal confusion, fear, and alarm, speaking from experience, that can be very difficult. That's why we often need help. And I'm suggesting that may be particularly helpful coming from people who have already sought to do that through insights that they have gained together from their own lived experience and shared identities. So if we recognize it with trauma, recognize it, for example, with sexual abuse, we need to recognize it, I'm saying, these connections more generally, not as a universal panacea, not something that's always going to help us understand, but another insight, not in a narrow way, but broadly making social, political, economic, and cultural connections beyond ourselves as individuals. That is also perhaps in relation to racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, from being children when we wouldn't necessarily have even fully recognized or understood the oppression we might be going through. Often now, the problems the child experiences, I'm suggesting, are left to the future adult to sort out, often then with little support, equipment, or opportunity. And I think not only do we need the support, which we know is terribly lacking for children and young people, but we need to have opportunities to work to understand ourselves better from childhood on, for two reasons at least. First, because the child really is the parent of the adult, in the sense of having laid down or had laid down for them many things which, as we enter adulthood and become adults, we may want to reassess or change. Do we hold fast to what we were taught, to parental and other messages, or want to revisit them? Is it wise just to take them for granted as givens in how we live our life, think about ourselves, or might we want to work out those things again for ourselves too? It can be difficult to recognize, I'm speaking from experience, the received messages in our lives. Sometimes we can even hear ourselves saying things like our parents or guardians did, and it can give us a strange feeling to realize that. But there's also a second thing. Are the assumptions, ideas, and attitude which we once took for granted still helpful and appropriate for the changed times and understandings we now live in? So this is about reassessing the structural impacts on us and how they've influenced and continue to influence our thought and action. Times change. They've changed enormously during my lifetime. Understandings and attitudes change, sometimes happily for the better, if not sometimes for the worse. I believe it's helpful for us to try and reassess our relationships with these changes. I'm not saying that change is necessarily good, but I think it's important about how we regard ourselves, the world, and other people. I grew up in a complicated and difficult family where there were unresolved and unaddressed issues of loss, denial, secrets, abuse, and isolation. Of course, I've had chances to reflect on that since, but then I had little equipment with which to deal with or make sense of it. It was, of course, my and my sister's normal, and it connected poorly with the wider world, the world of school and other people, and prepared, I think, me badly for it and for connecting helpfully with it. Now, I'm not complaining, just trying to be honest as I can, and in the light of the help I received in trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense of it. So I would say what was helpful about my treatment, if you call it that, that's to say the formal help I received, was twofold. First, it helped me to deal with the here and now problems, which I had of agoraphobia, anxiety, depression, through practical techniques, like, for example, breathing exercises, relaxation, and CBT. Secondly, ongoing long-term support of the NHS psychologists helped me to make sense of myself, what had gone wrong, what might help long-term, and the active role I had to take in my own recovery, or perhaps it would be better to say renewal. That psychologist was a terrific helper. I realized quickly that in addition to her own skills and understanding, her own training and expertise, she had that amazing capacity to listen to people, to me, and where I was coming from, what I felt I needed to get help with and work on. So in effect, before the terminology was really around, it truly felt like a work of co-production. And since then, I've come to feel the best support is very likely always to be a matter of co-production, of service user, helper, professional, working together on equal terms in a shared project for help, where the equal involvement and understanding of both are paramount, where living experience, experiential knowledge, and what people might see as expert knowledge and practice wisdom can work together for participatory change. That, for me, is the best practice, informed by the lived experience of the service user and the expertise of the worker, the two coming together in what can be amazingly helpful ways. Thanks, everybody. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. That was very, very, very interesting and thought-provoking, and I'm very, very happy to have been here and heard you present today. You talked about so many things there. Of course, finishing with the idea of co-production, which is central, as you'll know, as people will know, to the sort of legislation and policy in Wales. Of course, we can then discuss whether that's what that means in practice, and how people, where there might be gaps between what's in the legislation and what people's experiences and all those kind of things. But I think those sorts of ideas, of course, hugely relevant in Wales, in England, in the UK, everywhere that these sorts of services and lives are going on. So I mean, I've got a question, and I suppose as chair, I can pick myself first and ask a question, and then that will also give people a chance to collect their thoughts. There's a couple of comments or questions in the chat already, but I'm sure people are still mulling those over. I suppose I liked the quote you started with. I thought it does have a sort of inherent contradiction almost to the two parts of the quote, but I liked how you explained how that worked together, and that our uniqueness doesn't take away the fact that we share this trait of uniqueness doesn't make us any less unique. I thought that was a helpful way of explaining what that quote was about. I suppose then I was interested in what you think about this. So is there a balance, or is there maybe even a tension between the principle of approaching everyone individually and holistically, and not making that kind of crass distinction between there are some people who are mentally unwell and then there are other people who are not, but that idea that distress and madness are part and parcel of human experience, and depending on circumstances, we can all we all have a shared part of those experiences to some extent. Obviously, different people have a greater or lesser experience of distress and madness, but that's circumstantial rather than inherent to us. So you've got that sort of individual, which I really like. But you also talk, I think, very eloquently about the strength that people find in a shared sense of identity and being part of a community and recognizing that shared experience. So I suppose, do you see that as a balance or a tension to be resolved? How do you conceptualize that sort of very individual idea with the real strength that people do get from recognizing, that shared humanity and that shared experience that some people have, that not everyone will have that same experience, and there's some power there too, I think. So yeah, I don't know if that's a question or just a rambling comment, but I'm interested.
Thanks, David. I want to offer an initial health warning to everybody that I may not be able to answer every question adequately, which is certainly the possibility. I think everything you've said is kind of true. And I just think we have to start with a minimal number of assumptions of any kind. And of course, we all of us even start off with loads of assumptions about ourselves. And I think actually that for many of us, the dominant assumption we start off with about ourselves, especially if we do experience the kind of difficulties that we're talking about today, is to think badly of ourselves. And the overall culture, for all the talk about, talking to each other is good and all that stuff, the reality is that how we structure, quotes, mental health services, the priority that we as a society give them, what happens to you if you need to turn to an income source other than your earnings if something goes wrong, all say to us quite loudly, you're kind of rubbish, really. Not only that, but you're a kind of rubbish that's not to be trusted. And it may be that you're not to be trusted by virtue of being seen as an irrational person who experiences the opposite of mental well-being, that's seen as part of the package you bring to the table. But it also seems to be increasingly, and it seems to have happened bit by bit, almost unnoticed, you are treated with almost complete distrust by what are called, quote, still the welfare benefits system. And of course, it now begins to feel, and I speak from having close contact with this through not only my own past, and it was not as bad in those days, experience of the welfare benefit system, but hearing a lot about how it is from people now. It is truly a cruel, harsh, and arbitrary system. And we talk about mental health services, but of course, if you have times of distress, you're also going almost certainly to need to turn to welfare benefits, to housing, to the whole kind of constellation of help that's meant to be out there, much of which treats you as a less than good person. And the most recent and I think it's particularly awful expression of that are the comments that have been made by the Minister Braverman about homeless people. I mean, anybody who's been homeless, and I do speak from a little experience, let alone been on welfare benefits, truly, unless they've got the hide of a dinosaur, how would you want to be in that situation? So I think that these are complex questions demanding subtle answers, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I'm sure people have seen those comments about the lifestyle choice of homelessness. I think that was the comments you're talking about, wasn't it? That kind of a complete writing off, I guess, of everyone's experiences and the complexity of that, as you've just commented on. There's a couple of comments that I want to come to in the chat, but I'm also aware that Claire has a hand up. So Claire, we're just going to come to you.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Or good afternoon. It's been a long morning already. Peter, I'm in awe at your chatting today. That's the only way that I can put it. Is I fully agree with everything you say, except coming from the housing sector, you almost put us all into a blanket of almost a mistrust association then. And I, just for my own personal satisfaction, I suppose, I wanted to just clear that comment up, that, you know, we are not all the same. We genuinely aren't. I've been a manager in social housing now for, oh gosh, a long time. And I've, in my previous life, worked as a benefit advisor since God was little. And not all services are the same. You have good and bad everywhere. Personally, my team, I haven't had an eviction for 10 years. I don't support eviction in the slightest whilst people are engaging, because nobody wakes up and intentionally thinks, oh, I know today I should be homeless. Nobody ever does that. That's an absolute untruth. Having experience of the mental health services, and like yourself, having suffered childhood abuse, I think that we have a better understanding more than anybody of the system. I do agree with you with the harsh, arbitrary system that is the benefit system. And actually, I'm appearing on BBC News next week to talk about the arbitrary system that is universal credit. But being a landlord of 5,000 homes and having a welfare benefit team that are absolutely fantastic and work for our tenants. We've never lost a tribunal. We support them. Just this year, up until today's date, we've put just over 2 million back into our tenants' pockets. And that doesn't include things like housing costs, because, you know, we don't include those, because at the end of the day, they benefit us, but 2 million back into our tenants' pockets. So yeah, we're not all bad. Not all. Some are, but some of us are heroes without capes. Just saying.
Well, I should say, Claire, and thank you for that, and I think it's helpful to focus more on housing, that in the comments I made, I certainly wasn't intending to make any blanket condemnatory comments about housing, or particularly about housing associations. I do think it's interesting that over my lifetime, I've seen a radical change from the 1980s to where there was a notion before that of public housing, that could be a benefit which people in society could receive to equal out the ways in which the market, which commodifies housing, wasn't really fair. And that I know of areas where people, when they got married, would get a council house. I mean, it sounds bizarre now that people could. And of course, in the old days, and I'm talking about days before the Thatcher government, the proportion of income that housing took was minuscule next to the massive proportion it takes now. But we've since then come to call it social housing, and it's then been put into a corner as the kind of housing only people with special needs or some equivalent label would need, as though the rest of us can manage. Well, I'm seeing people now who would have 2 middle-class incomes, perhaps small children, who cannot get out of the trap of living in unreliable, poor quality, inadequately supervised private landlord renting accommodation. And that goes for more and more people. So housing is a problem. So there are kind of material reasons for housing being a problem around people with mental health issues. There's something else I want to talk on, which takes forward what you've been saying, which I became acquainted with by my partner, who's long worked as a palliative care social worker in London. And what she told me about was that when there were, as sometimes could be, differences between tenants in social housing, that the tendency was, and this is based on significant experience and follow-up, the tendency was for the person who was at the receiving end of the problem to be the one who it was suggested should move. rather than the person who created the problem. And that there's an awful lot more issues there than I can elaborate now. It's not just about one person being good or bad, but it is about us having a housing system which I believe overall is anti-personal. We did a very large piece of research funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation some years back about the social care system, which extended to other related services. And one of the big conclusions that the wide group of us came to, we included researchers, professional service users, was that whatever was good about the system that was there to help people, and this really reflects what you've been saying, Claire, was to do with the people working in it. And whatever was bad was to do with the structures and the systems that system operated with, whether we were talking about social care or housing or whatever. And I think that's really important. We need really to renew our structures. They've been pressing in a direction to do with commodification and profit for some years now. And the daily headlines show how unhelpful that is if we're talking about human rights and needs.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm one of the biggest supporters of social housing because obviously I work in it, but a lot needs to change. And I mean, we're lucky in Wales, we've got the new Renting Homes Wales Act, which prohibits the use of Section 21. You're not so lucky in England, sadly. And it's tough. Do you know what? It's really tough. My son is just leaving the forces after 18 years. 18 years, 2 tours of duty, the second tour of duty, both in Afghanistan. He was injured. He's had to leave because of a continuous injury, and he cannot get housing. He cannot get housing. And what's really poor is after serving his country for 18 years, his mental health is now suffering, and there is absolutely no support, none. So I have deep sympathy from personal experience too, because England is just not on the game, sadly. They are really not on the game, not for anyone. Agree with your private sector. Yeah, definitely. The private sector is really, really poor. Can't help all the people all the time. But thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Claire, and for sharing some of your experiences both at work and of course in relation to your own family. There was a question here from EJ asking about the I guess the sort of influence of the sort of pharmaceutical industry. You talked as part of your presentation, Peter, about the kind of medicalized response to what gets categorized as mental illness, and the question in the chat, I guess, is the kind of collective action that we've seen from health workers recently, doctors, nurses, and so on, seems to have little impact on the on the system. I guess comes back to what you were saying with Claire. Really good people, perhaps, sure all of them are, and good intentions, and yet the system is the thing that they're protesting against. So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, about the influence of maybe it goes even beyond government systems and into the influence of these kind of multinational pharmaceutical companies. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's almost impossible to measure the impact, the power, the influence of the pharmaceuticals. And we need to remember that the pharmaceuticals are part of a bigger constellation of industries focused on chemicals, and sometimes interrelated, which are to do with agribusiness and what's put on the land, which is to be connected with military undertakings and equipment to kill people. And so the pharmaceuticals are part of this massive range of activities operating in a very particular way, where we've seen serious concerns growing over the years, for example, in the way in which they manipulate publications and findings so that negative findings don't get published, so that people who've really not had any real role in producing evidence are signatories to the evidence that's offered. And I think it's impossible to talk about the use of pharmaceuticals in relation to mental distress without needing to have a more balanced approach to the means of production, to pharmaceutical companies. I would want to make it absolutely clear, and it's a lesson I learned a long time ago in the service user movement, that people have different attitudes. There are, it is not a matter of drugs bad, drugs good. I think it's to do with how they're used. It's to do with the need for readjustment of the relationship, I think, between psychiatry and the drug industry. I saw something very different, I felt, in relation to the work that my partner did, and we got involved in research in relation to that, the use of pharmaceuticals over pain relief. And you can see the way in which in that aspect of our lives, they have done wonderful things to reduce the possibility and likelihood of people having pain, which damages what life they have, if the medics and the medical system can match up to that. So that there is no crude answer here, but there are crude issues about the overuse of pharmaceuticals, and it extends beyond pharmaceuticals. It's not just that there's an overuse and a crude use and inappropriate use often of pharmaceuticals, and they offer, for those who want to take a simplistic way out of their responsibility as treaters, it isn't just that. There is more to it. There is the broader impact I think it has had on psychological thinking, so that we have something which I mentioned, like behavior therapies, CBT, which have their limitations and can be put to unhelpful use, but which also are crudified, if that's the right word, and made very simplistic and devalued and degraded, and used in a mechanistic way, in the same way that I think often can be done with pharmaceuticals. And yet all the so-called talking treatments, as long as they stick to what I would see as key principles, that they are egalitarian, that they are about listening, that they are about an ambition for co-production, they have much to offer, as does pharma in its way too. Let's not forget that. But using those talking treatments crudely, reducing it. I remember an advisory group I was on at the very beginning of the move to more talking treatments, where people were saying they were getting half a dozen sessions. And people actually said round the table, that could mean that there were enough sessions to reawaken issues in relation to your distress, but not to resolve them. This is about, I think you're right to raise this question, but it's like many of the sad questions that we get in relation to our mental well-being. It really helps us then to see a kettle of worms, and there are such big structural things here, and I fear that we often have policymakers and politicians who are very reluctant to take on the power of what actually are global companies. I mean, very powerful international companies, some of which I don't doubt have got economies larger than that of some small states.
Thank you, Peter. We can come to Edwin now if you want to ask your questions.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hello.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, Peter, thank you very much for your honesty and sharing your experiences. That's much appreciated. I'm trying to put these in the context from the chat that I put in there. I think the issues that you raise about labeling, barriers and assumptions, and the model of co-production, which is for me is a passion, really. I'm coming from the point of view of lived unpaid carer, but also with lived experience, which I won't go into details. But I understand where you're coming from. From my experience working in local authority for 38 years, those are very pertinent issues that I come up against, where the label seems to dictate the service that you get, not the person who you are. And that is very derogatory. And sometimes people don't have the opportunity in terms of they have any aspiration. The labels seem to dictate where they're at and whether they make any progress towards achieving what they would like to achieve, if they have any goals. the barriers and assumptions in a modern Britain are also synonymous with that. In 1999, the Euro-American Psychological Society Association made that very point in that our training and our institution are way behind where they should be in addressing issues of a modern world and a modern society in terms of acknowledging our diversity, our ethnicity, our different labels that we have in terms of disabilities. And that really makes me feel very sad when we can do so much more. And coming to the issue and the model of co-production, I think that approach, hopefully, now that is enshrined in ways at least with the devolved government in the 2014 Act, giving people a voice and working in identifying the needs from service users and carers and other members of the community. I think what needs to happen is recognizing, like yourself, we as unpaid carers and those with lived experiences have expertise in our own right, and how we can work with professionals and how they can accept and acknowledge that if we can do so, working together, the services that we can produce would be far better and far more responsive. And we are a resource. As the First Minister, when he was Health Minister, launched the 2014 Act, made that very point, that there's so many wonderful work done by unpaid carers, which goes unrecognized. But if you can recognize that, it could make we'll be in a different place. One of the issues some of the researchers made was that professionals see themselves as fixers of problems. What the co-production approach is, they say, look at, you need to change that stance. There might be fears about the approach that you have in terms of understanding the barriers and the assumption that sometimes you make. But if you can look at the change to become more facilitating, that would be a much better approach than there is currently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edwin. Goodness me, you've both raised and I think offered the route to understanding a massive range of issues. I think one of the things that I valued in what you said was the way that I think increasingly now that we can see ourselves as people as service users and people with support caring responsibilities for us as real allies and overlapping groups rather than potential enemies or one group speaking on behalf of another. And I think I've seen that change grow during the time I've been involved in user-led organizations, and I've seen organizations begin greatly to value that. I don't think we've yet got carer organizations, talking about the UK and England, which adequately reflect that. I think that still they are often controlled by people whose primary background is as professionals. And I can't tell you how despairing it makes me when I hear, as one does at regular intervals, from such big carer organizations, how many billions of pounds carers save governments. The government would just simply rub their hands and think, yeah, go on, mate, you keep doing it, sucker, and not care a damn, because what's on offer to support carers who face frequently really difficult situations and are expected to handle difficulties, whether we're talking about a family member who faces an impairment or faces distress or learning difficulties, which we know require the most inordinate skills, which it might require a professional, and are left so often on their own. And the brutal truth is that the whole philosophy of neoliberal governments, and we've had them now since the end of the 1970s, that's half a century. And we have had a continuation of that, of cutting public services, of requiring people to look after themselves, accentuating the unpaid carer rather than the resource from society collectively provided, is to make things worse. And I think that's dreadful. And it's not surprising that many people can't manage. And I know that things are happening now, which I don't think had happened since before the welfare state, of people basically being confined to their homes with their distress, getting no help, their family members getting little or no help, and they're being tortuous situations, which sometimes are only broken when the police have to intervene. And that is a terrible indictment of society. I think what we must do is, which I think is very difficult in our society, where there's been so much kind of dislocation of what is political and what is personal, where we need, in fact, to think in the opposite way around of the close relations of the political and the personal, is we need to make it more possible for all of us to play our part as citizens who can influence the policy and politics that are around, rather than just confine us to individualized roles as human beings. And the unfortunate reality is that the model of psychiatry, which sees the solution in the individual, rather than recognizing the social relations I emphasized, is one that plays into perfectly in sympathy with neoliberalism, which says if you've got a problem, stand on your own 2 feet and sort it out. Well, we are not living in times that are suitable for that. You know, the days of women as surplus to the workforce, doing all the tidying up at home, they've gone. What it actually often is woman as childcare primary support, woman as carer primary support, woman as employer primary support, etc. And this also when family members are being spread further and further away from each other. These are untenable and outmoded understandings. All this needs to have a politics that matches the understanding that's needed. And I'm afraid that we only have to look at the daily headlines to realize at the moment we're far from that.
Thank you for that. We are rapidly running out of time, so we've got maybe 5 minutes, and then just times for thank yous and the final poll. I know, Edwin, you've got your hand back up. I feel bad for having to make decisions, but I guess that comes with the territory of chairing. Tamara's been waiting very patiently, I'm sure, with her hand up, and I'd like to get that question in if I can, and then I will see if we've got any time left to come back to you, Edwin. And indeed, there are more questions in the chat. I'm afraid we probably won't get around to them all, but Tamar, if you could ask your question, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
So hi, yeah, thanks for that. Hi, I'm Tamar, know Peter from the Ad Studies monthly event that run. Peter's come along to that before. I was just thinking of it was something that we'd heard in a co-production event where someone had said that we have loads of these talks and that we all know kind of essentially you know what the issues are. You know, we talk about the funding not being there or being given to the wrong people, you know, that service user led events and led projects aren't being given the funding. Instead they're given to, you know, larger funders like NHS or Mind or what have you, and then we have to sort of scramble to get whatever piece of the pie they want to give us. And how things like mad studies and our ways of knowledge and learning you know, don't get put forward. And there was something as well about the way that Peter had said about how when they do, they get appropriated in a way, because things like peer working, for instance, that is something that came from the MAD movement that kind of got suckered into the NHS and then has been sort of appropriated and exploited. So what I was going to ask essentially is that and so what bit, because we talk about it, what can we do about it? We all know it's all about power. What can we do to address the power imbalances? Because we're always having these talks, you know, we've got so much power. No, sorry, we haven't got the have at the moment, but what can we do to redress that? Because we've got so much knowledge, and there's money behind it. Other people take the money, they take our, so I'll shut up, but over to you. What do you think?
Well, Tamar, if you're expressing any frustration, any anger, then you and me are both. It drives me balmy in another sense, the way in which it's such a taken for granted. I do think there is one thing, and it's easy to say, and it's not necessarily very reassuring, but the sessions that you offer, once from your ward, from your private hospital bed supplied by the NHS, are incredibly important as part of our big struggle, which is to change our own minds. We may have real struggles changing the funders and the policymakers, but every time one more person is part of this, it's another major brick in the wall. The other thing I think, because I think it really does apply, particularly around issues of mental health and disability, this is what I can't cope with and keep going on about. Can you imagine, and I've said this before, probably to you, if you had organizations now campaigning in relation to women and women's issues, in relation to Black and minoritized people, in relation to LGBTQ plus people, all of which were women led by men, Black led by white people, LGBT by heterosexuals, there would be an outcry. Why is it okay to do it in relation to disability and mental health, where the prevailing money and the prevailing charities are dominated by people who do not have lived experience? We've got to bang that message away. I think it's so important. It's outrageous. I think it's appalling. I think people in the new social movements, of which we're one, have really made a major, major difference, which has had effects on public policy. The women's movement and so on really have begun over the last 30, 40 years to make a difference. It's a long haul, but we are in the same boat. And I think because of intersectionality, that, if you're a mental health service user, you may be a woman, you may be LGBTQ, you may be all these. We've got to build those alliances and relationships, because as the people say, that at the moment 1% of the world is controlling 99%. But if our 99% can stop being little 0.5% and 1% and get together in equality, with equality as the 99%, we can begin to call a halt. But I mean, how would you not be depressed when you have people masquerading as political leaders like Braverman and our Prime Minister, who say and do the most wicked and terrible things, in my opinion?
Thank you, Peter. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but that was a very passionate and well said answer to that final question. So I think that is a great note to end on. I think your analogy with other civil rights movements throughout history and who we would expect those to be led by is a really powerful one, and brooks no argument, really. Thank you again for coming along, Peter. Thanks for sharing your expertise today. Much appreciated. Thank you to everyone who has joined in, either by asking questions or making comments, or simply just being here, listening, being part of that group and taking things away, no doubt, from what people have said and what Peter has said. Fantastic. So I think that's everything from me. Apologies again for not getting around to all the questions. I think the nature of the topic is such we could have been here all afternoon and carried on the discussion, and hopefully the discussion will carry on in other forums. I've no doubt it will. There were some links put in the chat for people to come along to other events, to learn more about the charity and the participation work that Peter does through Shaping Our Lives. So lots of other opportunities, I am sure, for that. But thank you for coming. Hopefully you see more events at ExChange in future, and enjoy the rest of your day.